Power can blind even those sworn to uphold justice. When a notorious magistrate humiliated a quiet black man in her courtroom, she expected his absolute submission. She didn't realize she had exactly 7 minutes left on the bench, and the man she mocked was holding her handcuffs. Gavel strikes echoed through the heavy oak panels of courtroom 302, a sound that Judge Margaret Kensington believed was the closest thing to the voice of God on earth. For 15 years, she had ruled over her jurisdiction, in the heart of the city, with an iron fist and a startlingly clear bias. Her reputation was an open secret within the local bar association. If you were white and wealthy, you received grace. If you were a minority, especially black or brown, you received the absolute, crushing maximum the law would allow. She hid her prejudice behind the guise of being tough on crime, a political slogan that kept her elected and untouchable. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light filtering through the high, arched windows, completely at odds with the stifling, oppressive atmosphere below. Tuesday morning dockets were notoriously crowded, filled with minor infractions, traffic disputes, and low-level misdemeanors. To Margaret, it was a parade of the city's failures. She adjusted her reading glasses, looking down her sharp nose at the paperwork handed to her by the court clerk, Richard. Standing before the bench was a man named Donald Wright. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a meticulously pressed, albeit modest, charcoal gray suit. His posture was impeccably straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He was present to contest a convoluted, seemingly manufactured citation regarding a commercial property zoning violation. It was the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that usually warranted a quick dismissal or a small fine, but Margaret had already made up her mind the moment she saw him step past the heavy wooden swinging doors. Margaret scanned the citation, a cruel, tight smile playing on her lips. She didn't see a citizen exercising his right to a fair hearing. She saw a target. "Mr. Wright," Margaret began, her voice dripping with a condescension that immediately caused the chatter in the gallery to die down. "I am looking at this file, and I must confess I am struggling to understand why you are wasting this court's valuable time. You are accused of operating an unlicensed commercial venture out of a residential zoned district. A mechanic's garage, is it?" "No, Your Honor," Donald replied, his voice calm, deep, and remarkably steady. "As the brief filed by my counsel indicates, the property is a registered community outreach center. We repair bicycles for underprivileged youth. It operates entirely under the 501(3) nonprofit code, which exempts it from the specific commercial zoning statute cited by the officer." Margaret waved a dismissive hand in the air, leaning back in her high-backed leather chair. It squeaked, loudly, in the quiet room. "Please, spare me the community savior routine. I've been sitting on this bench long enough to recognize a front when I see one. A bunch of young men gathering in a garage in that specific neighborhood? I know exactly what kind of business is being conducted there, and it certainly isn't charity." The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Arthur Pendleton, the elderly bailiff who had served in courtroom 302 for a decade, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He had seen Margaret cross the line countless times, but her blatant racial profiling was becoming increasingly reckless. Donald didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply met her gaze, his dark eyes unreadable. "Your Honor, the documentation clearly proves—" "I don't care about your forged paperwork, Mr. Wright," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising in volume, echoing off the mahogany walls. "You people come into my courtroom, dressed in your Sunday best, thinking you can pull the wool over my eyes. You think a cheap suit masks what you really are. I see right through you. You're trying to skirt the law because you believe the rules of civilized society don't apply to your demographic." A collective gasp, soft but distinct, rippled through the spectators sitting in the wooden pews behind Donald. Even the prosecuting attorney, a young man named Simon Caldwell, who usually relished Margaret's harshness, looked down at his shoes, visibly cringing. "My demographic, Your Honor?" Donald asked. His tone was dangerously smooth, like ice over a deep river. He wasn't defensive. He was probing. "Don't play coy with me," Margaret sneered, leaning over the bench, her face flushed with the intoxicating rush of unchallenged power. "You know exactly what I mean. I deal with the fallout of your neighborhood's culture every single day. The crime, the laziness, the sheer refusal to contribute anything meaningful to this city. You stand there pretending to be a pillar of the community, but I know the statistics. I know the reality. You're just another grifter looking for a handout, trying to run a chop shop under the guise of charity." She slammed her hand flat against the desk. "I should have you remanded into custody right now for perjury based on this ridiculous affidavit alone." Donald looked at the wall clock positioned directly above the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. It was 10:14 a.m. "Your Honor," Donald said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an authority that seemed completely out of place for a defendant facing down a tyrannical judge. "I strongly suggest you review the documents provided by the state, rather than relying on your personal prejudices." Margaret's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated fury. In 15 years, no defendant had ever dared to speak to her with such a command. She reached for her gavel, her knuckles turning white. "How dare you?" she hissed, the microphone on her desk amplifying her vitriol. "You arrogant, entitled. You do not tell me how to run my court. I am the law in this room. I hold your freedom in the palm of my hand, and you have the audacity to disrespect me? I will bury you so deep in the county jail you won't see sunlight until your hair turns gray." Donald didn't look at his lawyer. He didn't look at the gallery. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Margaret Kensington. He slowly reached up and tapped his right earlobe, a motion so subtle that almost no one noticed it. But to the 3 men and 2 women sitting inconspicuously in the back row of the gallery, it was a flare in the night sky. "Are you stating for the official court record, Judge Kensington, that you are making a ruling based on my race and your assumptions about my neighborhood rather than the legal merits of the case?" Donald asked. It was a trap. Any seasoned attorney, any rational human being, would have recognized it. But Margaret's ego was a blindfold. She felt untouchable. "I am stating for the record," Margaret shouted, her composure entirely shattered, "that I know a criminal when I see one, and your kind always ends up right where you are standing in front of me, begging for a mercy you don't deserve. Court reporter, make sure you get every word of this. I want it on the record that this court will not tolerate the insolence of street thugs masquerading as citizens." The court stenographer, a nervous woman named Brenda, froze, her fingers hovering over her machine. She looked up at Margaret, terrified, but the judge just glared at her. "Type it, Brenda!" Brenda's fingers flew across the keys, officially etching Margaret Kensington's career suicide into the unalterable county archives. Donald checked his watch again. 10:17 a.m. 4 minutes had passed since her initial tirade. 3 minutes left. "Judge Kensington," Donald said, stepping slightly away from the defendant's table, "you have violated the Judicial Code of Conduct, the Civil Rights Act, and your oath of office. You have explicitly stated your prejudice on the record." "I hold you in contempt of court," Margaret roared, grabbing her gavel and slamming it down with such force that a crack splintered the wooden sounding block. "Bailiff Pendleton, cuff this man immediately. 30 days in county lockup for contempt. No bail." Bailiff Pendleton hesitated. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand resting nervously on his utility belt. He looked at Donald, expecting the man to panic, to run, or to beg. Instead, Donald unbuttoned the jacket of his charcoal suit. "Arthur, stop," Donald said gently to the bailiff, using his first name. Pendleton stopped dead in his tracks. Margaret stood up behind the bench, her black robes billowing around her like a storm cloud. "Bailiff, I gave you a direct order. Arrest him!" Donald reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. In a standard courtroom, a defendant reaching into a concealed pocket would result in drawn weapons and panic. But Arthur Pendleton didn't move, and neither did the court security officers stationed by the doors. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. From his pocket, Donald withdrew a genuine leather wallet and flipped it open. Pinned to the leather was a heavy, gleaming silver badge, accompanied by a laminated federal identification card. Donald Wright, Special Agent in Charge, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption, and Civil Rights Division, Donald announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the stunned courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Margaret Kensington stood frozen, her mouth slightly ajar, the gavel still gripped tightly in her raised hand. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. What is this?" Margaret stammered, the booming authority of her voice suddenly reduced to a weak, reedy whisper. "Is this a joke? Because if this is a prank, I will have you federal." "It's not a prank, Margaret," Donald interrupted, discarding the formal "Your Honor" for the first time. "For the past 14 months, my division has been conducting a deep-cover investigation into the 14th District Court system. We received over 40 anonymous complaints from defense attorneys and civil rights advocates regarding your discriminatory sentencing practices and alleged financial kickbacks connected to the private prison sector." Donald took a step toward the bench. "We needed to establish a pattern of indisputable, documented prejudice and a willingness to bypass the law to satisfy your personal bias. We needed you to say the quiet part out loud. On the official record," he gestured toward Brenda, the stenographer, who was staring at him in shock. "And you just gave us the final piece of evidence we needed." At that moment, the courtroom doors swung open. The 5 individuals who had been sitting quietly in the back row stood up simultaneously. They shed their nondescript jackets to reveal windbreakers emblazoned with large yellow letters, FBI. Prosecutor Simon Caldwell backed away from his table, his hands raised in surrender, wanting absolutely no part of what was happening. The gallery erupted into a cacophony of whispers and gasps. "You can't do this," Margaret screeched, panic finally setting in. She looked wildly around the room, realizing that her domain, her kingdom, had just been breached. "I am a sitting judge. I have immunity. You have no jurisdiction here." Judicial immunity does not cover federal civil rights violations, conspiracy, and extortion, Margaret, Donald replied, walking calmly past the defense table and approaching the steps leading up to the judge's bench. "Arthur, get them out of here," Margaret ordered, but her voice cracked. Bailiff Pendleton looked at the judge, then at the federal agents securing the doors, and finally at Donald. He slowly unclipped his radio, set it on a nearby table, and took 2 large steps back, crossing his arms. He was done. Donald climbed the 3 wooden steps to the bench. For the first time, he was looking down at Margaret Kensington. "Judge Margaret Kensington," Donald said, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "you are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." He reached to his back belt loop and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. They clinked together a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to shatter the last remnants of Margaret's illusion of power. It was 10:21 a.m. Exactly 7 minutes had passed since she first opened her mouth to insult him. Cold steel clamped down on Margaret Kensington's wrists, the sharp, ratcheting sound echoing through the dead silent courtroom. It was a sound she had ordered hundreds of times, a mechanical click that signified the end of a citizen's freedom and the absolute triumph of her authority. Now, the cold metal was biting into her own skin, heavy and entirely foreign. The cold, heavy steel of the Smith & Wesson handcuffs bit aggressively into the delicate, manicured skin of Margaret Kensington's wrists. The sharp, mechanical ratcheting sound echoed through the cavernous, dead-silent courtroom. For 15 years, that precise metallic click had been the soundtrack of her absolute authority. It was a sound she had ordered hundreds of times from her elevated perch, a noise that signified the definitive end of a citizen's freedom and the triumph of her uncompromising will. Now, the metal was digging into her own flesh, shockingly heavy, icy, and entirely foreign. Agent Donald Wright secured the double-locking mechanism of the cuffs with practiced efficiency. His expression remained completely devoid of the malice and venom Margaret had just spewed at him moments prior. He was a professional executing a meticulously planned, long-term operation, completely unfazed by the title or the black robe of the woman standing before him. "Margaret Kensington, you have the right to remain silent," Donald recited. His voice was steady, calm, and authoritative, slicing cleanly through the rapid, shallow hyperventilation that had seized Margaret's chest. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." "Get your hands off me!" Margaret finally shrieked, the initial paralysis of shock shattering into raw, desperate indignation. She twisted her shoulders violently, attempting to wrench her arms free from his grip, but Donald held her firmly by the bicep. Her flowing black judicial robe, historically a symbol of her untouchable prestige and intellect, now looked like a tangled, suffocating shroud. "This is an absolute outrage. I am a sitting magistrate of the 14th District. I will have your badge for this, Agent Wright. I will call Mayor Thomas Sterling right now. I will have Governor Higgins on my private line in 5 minutes, and you will be directing traffic on a frozen highway in Alaska by tomorrow morning." Donald didn't blink. He didn't tighten his grip, but he didn't yield an inch. "Governor Higgins was briefed on this sting operation at 6 o'clock this morning," he replied smoothly, effortlessly, guiding her toward the edge of the elevated bench. "He signed off on the state-level coordination to bypass your local jurisdiction. As for Mayor Sterling, I strongly suggest you don't count on his political shelter. His offices at City Hall, along with his private residence, are currently being raided by my colleagues in the Anti-Corruption Task Force." Margaret's legs instantly turned to lead, her knees buckled beneath the heavy, polished oak desk. The invisible political firewall she had spent 15 years painstakingly building the intricate network of favors, campaign contributions, and backroom deals that made her feel invincible was evaporating into smoke before her very eyes. Donald caught her expertly under the arms, preventing her from collapsing completely to the floor, and hauled her roughly back to her feet. Down in the well of the court, the scene was one of rapidly unfolding, highly controlled chaos. 2 of the undercover FBI agents had moved with tactical precision to secure the perimeter, locking the heavy brass deadbolts on the main public entrance. Another agent, a tall woman with a stern face and her gold shield clipped prominently to her belt, approached the prosecution table. "Simon Caldwell," the female agent commanded, flashing her credentials. "Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, FBI. Step away from your files, lace your fingers together, and place them on the table where I can see them." Simon, the young, aggressively ambitious prosecutor who had eagerly pushed Margaret's draconian sentences to pad his own win record and launch his political career, looked as though he had been physically struck, all the color drained from his face. He raised his shaking hands, a fine sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "I didn't know," Simon stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "I swear to God, Agent Jenkins, I just prosecuted the dockets assigned to me. I was just doing my job. I didn't know she was taking dirty money or colluding. We will determine exactly what you knew and what you willfully ignored during your debriefing." "Mr. Caldwell," Agent Jenkins said coldly, her eyes boring into him, "sit down on that wooden bench. Do not touch your phone, do not speak to anyone, and do not move until I tell you to." Meanwhile, a 3rd federal agent had bypassed the chaotic well entirely and moved directly to the clerk's desk. Richard Simmons, the quiet, chronically anxious court clerk who had fetched Margaret's black coffee and silently filed her heavily biased rulings for a decade, sat perfectly still in his rolling chair. Margaret, being led awkwardly down the 3 small wooden stairs from her elevated bench, saw the federal agent approach her clerk. Blind desperation clawed at her throat. "Richard!" she yelled, her voice hoarse and commanding, falling back on years of demanding his obedience. "Richard, do not let them touch my computer. Call Harrison Gable. Tell him to get down here immediately. Secure my private chambers. Lock the doors, and do not let them near my personal files." Richard slowly looked up from his glowing computer monitor. He didn't scramble for the telephone. He didn't look panicked, intimidated, or subservient. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pair of thick-rimmed reading glasses, and deliberately placed them on his face. He looked directly into Margaret's panicked, bloodshot eyes, and for the first time in 10 long years, he didn't shrink under her terrifying gaze. "Agent Wright already has the files from your chambers, Margaret," Richard said. His voice was surprisingly steady, echoing clearly in the quiet room. He noticeably omitted the title, "Your Honor." Margaret froze on the bottom step, her mind struggling to process the ultimate betrayal. She stared at the man she had treated like a piece of office furniture. "What did you do?" she whispered, the horrifying realization finally dawning on her. "I did what I should have done 5 years ago," Richard replied simply, turning his back on her and facing his monitor once more. "Let's go, Margaret," Donald instructed, applying gentle but immovable pressure to her shoulder, pushing her forward. The walk down the center aisle of courtroom 302 was the longest, most agonizing journey of Margaret Kensington's life. The gallery, packed shoulder to shoulder with the working-class citizens who had come to contest minor traffic tickets and low-level misdemeanors, watched in stunned, breathless silence. These were the very people she had terrorized for a decade and a half. These were the faces she had routinely insulted, degraded, and fined into crippling poverty to feed a machine of corruption. As she was paraded past the heavily scarred wooden pews, the shock in the room began to undergo a palpable shift. The terror she normally instilled dissolved into something else. Someone in the back row pulled out a smartphone. A bright LED flash went off, blindingly white in the dim room. Then another, and another. "Put those away!" Margaret snapped instinctively, trying to hide her handcuffed wrists behind her back, but the bulky, restrictive sleeves of her judicial robe made it utterly impossible. "Bailiff, confiscate those devices immediately. I hold you all in contempt." Nobody moved. Arthur Pendleton, the elderly bailiff, stood by the heavy double doors, holding them wide open for the FBI agents. He looked right through Margaret as if she were a ghost. "I don't work for you anymore, ma'am," Arthur said quietly as she was marched past him. The hallway outside the courtroom was infinitely worse. Word of the raid had already spread like wildfire through the courthouse network. Clerks, paralegals, court reporters, other judges, and dozens of defense attorneys had poured out of their respective offices and courtrooms, lining the polished marble corridors. As Margaret was escorted toward the secure service elevators, a slow, highly rhythmic sound began to echo down the long hall. It started with a single, exhausted public defender, a woman whose clients Margaret had mercilessly targeted, tapping her knuckles against a wooden doorframe. Tap, tap, tap. Then, a paralegal joined in. Then another attorney. The tapping morphed into a slow, deliberate, mocking applause that rippled down the entire length of the courthouse corridor. Margaret kept her eyes glued firmly to the marble floor, her face burning with a humiliation so profound, so absolute, that she felt physically ill. The untouchable architect of 1,000 broken lives was finally feeling the crushing, inescapable weight of public disgrace. Fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead in Interrogation Room B at the FBI field office. The walls were painted a sterile, institutional gray, a stark contrast to the rich mahogany and leather of Margaret's judicial chambers. She had been sitting in the metal chair for 2 hours, stripped of her judicial robes, wearing only a wrinkled silk blouse and slacks. The heavy steel ring, embedded in the table, was a grim reminder of where she was, though Donald had allowed her to remain uncuffed while inside the room. The heavy steel door clicked open. Donald Wright walked in, carrying a thick accordion folder, followed by a sharply dressed man carrying a sleek leather briefcase. "Harrison," Margaret gasped, nearly launching herself out of the chair as her high-priced defense attorney, Harrison Gable, entered the room. "Thank God. Get me out of here. This is an illegal detention. They entrapped me." Harrison Gable did not look reassuring. His usually confident, shark-like demeanor was completely absent. He placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and sighed heavily. He didn't sit down next to her. He stood at the end of the table. "Sit down, Margaret," Harrison said flatly. "Excuse me?" Margaret bristled, her old arrogance trying to resurface. I am paying you $800 an hour to protect me, not to give me orders. I want bail set immediately. Donald pulled out the metal chair opposite her and sat down, dropping the heavy accordion folder onto the table with a loud thud. There will be no bail today, Margaret. You are considered a severe flight risk, given the offshore accounts we located this morning. Margaret's breath hitched. She looked at Harrison, her eyes wide with panic. Harrison, do something! Margaret, shut up and listen, Harrison snapped, rubbing his temples. I have just spent the last 90 minutes in a conference room with the United States Attorney. This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't a simple civil rights complaint. They have a mountain of evidence. I am here to negotiate your surrender, not your release. Surrender? Margaret practically spat the word. I have done nothing but clean up the streets of this city. Donald unspooled the string on the accordion folder and pulled out a stack of financial ledgers. They were bound in red leather. Margaret's stomach plummeted to the floor. They were her private, handwritten ledgers, the ones she kept locked in a biometric safe hidden behind a bookshelf in her chambers. Your clerk, Richard Simmons, has a phenomenal memory, Donald said, sliding the top ledger across the table. He also has a conscience. It took him a while to find his courage, but watching you sentence a single mother to 6 months in county jail for a first-time, non-violent misdemeanor because she couldn't afford a $2,000 fine was his breaking point. He approached us 11 months ago. Margaret stared at the red leather cover as if it were a venomous snake. Richard provided us with the dates and times you accessed your safe, Donald continued, his tone clinical and devastating. We obtained a covert federal warrant, bypassed the biometrics, and copied the contents over a weekend. We've been tracking the money ever since. Donald opened the ledger to a page bookmarked with a blue sticky note. Let's talk about Ironclad Corrections, Incorporated, shall we? A private prison conglomerate that recently won the state contract to manage the overflowing county facilities. Facilities that were overflowing, conveniently, because you were handing out maximum sentences for minor infractions. I sentence according to the sentencing guidelines. Margaret lied, her voice trembling. You exploit the maximum ceiling of those guidelines specifically to funnel bodies into Ironclad's facilities, Donald corrected her, pulling out a bank statement. And in return, William Taggart, the CEO of Ironclad, funneled consulting fees to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. A corporation under the name of your deceased sister. $2.4 million over the last 5 years. That's circumstantial, Margaret whispered, though she knew it wasn't. Is it? Donald asked, pulling out a transcript. Because we also tapped your phones. We have 36 recorded conversations between you and William Taggart. We have you negotiating the rate per prisoner. You literally sold human beings, Margaret. You sold the citizens of your own city for a profit. Harrison Gable closed his briefcase. The U.S. Attorney is offering a plea deal, Margaret. If you cooperate fully, turn state's evidence against William Taggart, Mayor Sterling, and the systemic corruption ring, they will cap their sentence recommendation at 20 years. 20 years? Margaret screamed, standing up. I'm 62 years old. That's a life sentence. I will not survive in a federal penitentiary. I am a judge. You were a judge, Donald corrected, looking up at her without an ounce of pity. And you won't be going to a minimum security federal camp. Because your crimes involve state-level extortion and abuse of the local populace, the state attorney general has insisted you serve your time in the very state facilities you helped overpopulate. The hard karma hit Margaret like a physical blow to the chest. She stumbled back, the back of her knees hitting the metal chair, and she collapsed into it. You're sending me to an ironclad facility? She breathed, sheer terror gripping her heart. She knew exactly what conditions were like in those prisons. She had helped create them by stripping away their oversight in her rulings. She knew the overcrowding, the violence, the lack of medical care. It seems only fitting, Donald said softly. You built that house, Margaret. Now you have to live in it. Donald leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Remember the community center you mocked this morning? The bicycle repair shop for underprivileged youth? Margaret looked at him, unable to speak. tears of absolute defeat finally spilling over her mascara-lined eyes. "That was a real charity," Donald said, "run by a man named Elias Johnson, a man you sentenced to 5 years in an ironclad prison for a minor zoning violation 2 years ago. He lost his business. He lost his home. We took over the lease of his garage to run our sting operation, hoping you'd target it again. You couldn't resist. Your prejudice was so ingrained, so reflexive, that you didn't even bother to verify the paperwork before you tried to destroy another life." Donald stood up, gathering his files. Elias Johnson was released on federal appeal yesterday. His record has been expunged. He will be getting his garage back, fully funded by the seized assets from your Cayman accounts. He turned toward the door. "Enjoy your stay, Margaret. You have a lot of time to think about the people you stepped on to get to the top." 18 months later, the atmosphere inside the United States District Court was heavy, but it lacked the toxic, oppressive fear that had once defined courtroom 302. Here, the air hummed with the quiet, terrifying machinery of absolute, impartial justice. Margaret Kensington sat at the defense table, completely unrecognizable from the terrifying magistrate she had been just a year and a half prior. The sharp, immaculate suits and the intimidating black robes were gone, replaced by a drab, ill-fitting beige jumpsuit issued by the Federal Holding Center. Her hair, once meticulously dyed and styled, had gone entirely silver, hanging limply around a face deeply lined with stress, sleepless nights, and the devastating loss of her empire. She kept her eyes glued to the scarred wooden surface of the table, unable to look at the gallery behind her. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity. It wasn't filled with the wealthy elite or the corrupt politicians she used to dine with. Mayor Thomas Sterling had already taken a plea deal, and William Taggart, the CEO of Ironclad Corrections, was currently fighting a losing battle against a 30-count federal indictment. Instead, the wooden pews were filled with the faces of the people Margaret had tried to erase: mothers, fathers, and children whose lives had been derailed by her ruthless, profit-driven sentencing. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Federal Judge Alistair Bennett, a man known throughout the circuit for his unshakable integrity and his zero-tolerance policy for public corruption. He looked down from his elevated bench, his expression completely unreadable as he reviewed the final pre-sentencing report. At the prosecution table sat United States Attorney Michael Harrington, alongside FBI Special Agent Donald Wright. Donald wore the same tailored charcoal gray suit he had worn on the day of the sting. He watched Margaret with a quiet, professional detachment. The operation was over. Today was simply the final accounting. Before this court passes sentence, Judge Bennett's deep voice resonated through the room. The prosecution has requested that one final victim impact statement be entered into the public record. Proceed, Mr. Harrington. The murmurs in the gallery hushed instantly as an older black man, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, slowly made his way to the podium, facing the bench. It was Elias Johnson, the owner of the bicycle repair charity that Margaret had mocked and destroyed. He wore a simple, clean button-down shirt. He adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. Margaret closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking through the deep wrinkles on her cheek. "Judge Bennett," Elias began, his voice gravelly but strong. 3 years ago, I stood in Margaret Kensington's courtroom. I tried to explain that my garage wasn't a business, but a safe haven for kids in my neighborhood who had nowhere else to go. I tried to show her the paperwork. She didn't look at it. She looked at my skin. She looked at my address, and she decided I was a criminal. Elias paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. She sentenced me to 5 years in an ironclad facility. In the first 6 months, I lost my home to foreclosure. My wife had to move in with our daughter in another state. While inside, I was assaulted twice because the guards were too understaffed to care. I lost everything I had spent 40 years building, not because I broke the law, but because the judge sworn to uphold it was selling us like cattle to line her own pockets. He turned his head slowly, looking directly at Margaret. She refused to meet his gaze. "I got my life back, thanks to Agent Wright and his team," Elias continued, turning back to Judge Bennett. I got my garage back, but I will never get those years back. And the hundreds of other people she sent away, the ones who didn't have the FBI looking into their cases, some of them are still in there. Some of them died in there. I don't ask for revenge, Your Honor. I just ask that she finally understands the hell she created. Elias stepped down, the silence in the courtroom so profound it was almost ringing. Judge Bennett folded his hands on top of the massive pile of case files. He looked directly at the defense table. Margaret Kensington, please stand. Margaret pushed herself up on trembling legs. Her attorney stood beside her, offering no comfort, only a physical presence required by law. Over the course of this trial, we have heard testimony detailing a level of systemic corruption that sickens the very foundation of the American judicial system, Judge Bennett stated, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it vastly more terrifying. You were entrusted with the sacred duty of dispensing justice blindly and fairly. Instead, you weaponized your prejudice and turned your courtroom into a human trafficking operation. You ruined families, destroyed communities, and betrayed your oath for $2.4 million. Margaret swayed slightly, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The plea agreement negotiated by your counsel caps the federal sentencing recommendation at 20 years. Judge Bennett continued, I accept this recommendation. However, I have coordinated extensively with the State Attorney General regarding the jurisdiction of your incarceration, given the unique nature of your crimes. Agent Donald Wright sat forward slightly. His eyes locked on Margaret Kensington. I hereby sentence you to serve 240 months in prison, without the possibility of early parole, Judge Bennett declared, the finality of the words striking Margaret like physical blows. Furthermore, it is the order of this court, in conjunction with state authorities, that you will not serve this time in a minimum security federal camp. You will be remanded immediately to the custody of the State Department of Corrections, where you will serve out your sentence at the Ironclad Women's Correctional Facility. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Even Margaret's attorney flinched. Block C, specifically, Judge Bennett added, his voice dropping an octave. The very maximum security block you personally insured remained at 140% capacity through your fraudulent sentencing. You will eat the food you deemed acceptable for them. You will sleep in the overcrowded cells you profited from. You will live among the very women you wrongfully condemned. Margaret's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the heavy wooden chair, a hollow, guttural sob tearing from her throat. It wasn't the dignified weeping of a remorseful public servant. It was the raw, primal terror of a predator realizing it had just been thrown into the cage with its victims. Bailiff, Judge Bennett said, reaching for his gavel. Remand the prisoner. Court is adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel was the last sound Margaret heard as a federal marshal stepped forward, pulling her arms painfully behind her back. As she was marched out the side door, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists, she didn't hear applause from the gallery. She only heard the devastating, absolute silence of a world that had finally balanced the scales. True justice possesses an undeniable, cyclical nature. When those in power weaponize the law to satisfy their prejudice and greed, they ultimately construct the very traps that will ensnare them. Margaret's devastating fall from a seemingly untouchable throne to the concrete floor of the prison she helped populate proves that arrogance blinds us to our own vulnerability, and karma rarely misses an appointment.